Thank you very much to BioStock for inviting me. I'd like to think that you're all here to hear me speak, but I realize you all want to just hear about the US election, and so I'll get to that. But I do want to set the stage a little bit. And if I might, these are DNB or my outlook. As Sonia said, I am the Senior Advisor for Healthcare for DNB, based out of New York. I've been in and around healthcare for over 35 years. Among other things, a commercial banker, an investment banker. I've been a sell-side equity research analyst, and for the past 15 years, I've been a strategist to the industry. Prior to joining DNB about 2 years ago, I spent a decade as the global head of healthcare research and strategy at MUFG, the large Japanese bank. So basically, in a very short version, my outlook or our outlook on the healthcare sector is good, is strong. We think the fundamentals are positive. These are our last year's projections. They're just about to be updated. And in particular, the biopharma one is going to be updated to about 80, 90 basis points higher growth rate. Probably not a surprise to the people in this room, but it's really driven by two things, one of which is the introduction of some of the immunoinflammatories, but really by one thing, which is the introduction of the GLPs. And they're having a significant impact on growth forecasts. We also have similar for the med tech space. Really, the graph on the right is the one that I'd want you to take away. So the black line on that graph is projections for the global pharma sector prior to the pandemic. So these were in 2019, 5- and 10-year projections for the global pharmaceutical industry. And the two green lines are the actual results, one of which is adjusted for the vaccines and treatments. And as you can see, no matter how you look at it, we are at where we expected to be before the pandemic. And again, to preview our upcoming publication, we're actually slightly ahead of where we were for the same reasons I just outlined. There are some challenges to the industry, and we'll talk about some of those, but really the biggest ones which were pandemic-related are really behind us. So the issues with supply chains, the inflationary environment, and even the interest rate environment seems to be moving in the right direction. As Sonia highlighted, you've heard quite a bit over the past 2 days. The capital markets are challenging at the moment. I'm here to give you what I consider to be a little bit of reality, which is you'll hear a lot of people get up and speak about how things are getting better. And they are. We've outlined some of the reasons why. At the same time, we're starting at an extremely low base. And if you start looking at, in particular, the graph I have here is U.S. high-yield bond issuance, which is very important to the global healthcare industry. It is down 64% at the trough, and it is improving off of that. But if you start stripping out refinancings versus new money, it's still a pretty challenging environment. I think my friends from NASDAQ have been getting beaten up a little bit. We think it will get better, but I don't know whether or not the US election is going to have an impact on that. So let's talk about the US election. I got to take my coat off for this. In order to begin, I need to give you a little bit of basis and a little bit of a refresher for those of you that already know it, and a little bit of a background as to how the US government actually works. So as you're probably aware, the US government has 3 branches, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. The easiest ones to understand from a Western European perspective is the judicial branch, exactly the same as it is in most Western European democracies. And then the legislative branch is our version of parliament, and we have similarly an upper house and a lower house, the upper house being the Senate and the lower house being the House of Representatives. The executive branch stands on its own, which is the President of the United States. Let me make one clear statement. The President of the United States is considered the most powerful person in the world because he is the commander-in-chief of the leading military in the world. The president himself has surprisingly little power in many things. And one of the areas where the president has surprisingly little power is in legislation. The US president is not the prime minister. Very, very different things. The US president has no control over the US budget. That is controlled solely by Congress. The US president has no control over legislation. He or she does not introduce legislation, cannot introduce legislation. That only happens in Congress. So when we look at Congress with our upper and lower house, there are very specifically designed roles there as well. And the first of which is that the House of Representatives, the lower house, is the only body that can introduce fiscal legislation. So they're the only ones that can introduce legislation having to do with money, whether it's income from taxes or whether it's the expenses of the US federal government. That legislation is then, if passed on to the upper house, the Senate, that has to ratify that legislation. And if they do not, it goes back to the House and goes back and forth until either they give up or they pass a piece of legislation. That's very important to remember when we're going to talk about the impact of the US election. The graphs you have up here in terms of the current balance of power in the House and the Senate is the current House and Senate, not the new one that has just been elected. But as you can see, both houses, very, very slim majorities, with the Republicans in control of the House and the Democrats in control of the Senate. So let's talk about the results of the US election. I'm going to start by saying two things. Uncertainty has increased, and volatility has increased. There is no way to avoid that. I'm here to give you an analysis, I hope, of the impact of that specifically on life sciences. But I think, bottom line, that the biggest impact of the US election is not on life sciences or healthcare. It is on all these other things from an economic and political perspective that will then impact healthcare indirectly. And we'll get to the specifics of that. The other sort of headline that I would like to dispel is that this was some kind of landslide. It really was not. President-elect Trump and the party are presenting it that way, that they have a mandate from the US people. That is incorrect in my opinion. And really, if you look at the results from the presidential point of view, which is the college, you see 312 being the majority that Trump won. That's only 5 more than last time around where he won. He has now, in the intervening period since Election Day, actually lost the popular vote, so to speak. In other words, it has fallen below 50% as all of the votes have been counted. And then if you look at both the current estimates for the Senate and the House. So the Senate is basically set at this point. And as you can see, the Republicans have a slim majority in the Senate, sort of slightly more than the Democrats had for the past couple of years, but not a lot, and we'll get to the details of that in a second. And then if you look at the House, there are still 5 races that are undecided in the House, but if those go the way they look they're going to go, there's going to be a slim majority, and it is actually going to be a decrease for the Republican control of the House from last time around by probably a handful of seats. They will have control of all 3 branches of government, so to speak, but it is not the landslide. And it's really important to understand the politics and the dynamics that are going to occur. So again, I'm going to talk about it a little more broadly before we get to the very specific way that it's going to impact healthcare. So if you look in the Senate, the current balance of power is 3 seats majority for the Republicans. So the 9 names that I have up there are 9 US senators that many of you probably don't know most of those names. You're going to be hearing a lot about those names in the next couple of years. And specifically, that is a group of US Republican senators that you can really consider to be not MAGA, not Trumpists per se. There is a mixed bunch in there, but there are 2 or 3 senators in there that did not endorse President-elect Trump during the election process. That's actually quite astounding in many ways. You've got a group of senators in there that have had their issues with President Trump in the past, and you have a group of senators in there that have already said publicly that they would not support some of the nominees that Trump has put forward for his cabinet. So this is going to be, for lack of a better term, the establishment Republicans, you could call it maybe the resistance in some ways, that you're going to be hearing a lot about. And that's really important in light of the fact that the control of the Senate is only by 3 seats. So it's not going to be quite the easy cakewalk that the Republicans like to present going forward. One of the first issues that came up was the election of a new Senate Majority Leader. There were clear candidates that were being supported by President-elect Trump. Neither of them won. And the Senate elected Senator Thune, who is an established establishment Republican in sort of the old guard, is not a MAGA Republican. Then the other thing to understand about the US Senate is that there is something called a filibuster. Now, the filibuster in certain circles is quite controversial, but it is a rule that basically says in order for a piece of legislation to be debated on the Senate floor and or voted upon, you must have at least 60% of the Senate vote in favor of that. If that does not occur, then you can hold what's called a filibuster, which in the old days literally was a senator getting up and talking and talking and talking until everyone gave up. They did away with that part of the rules, so basically you can just raise your hand and say, I'm opposed to this legislation. I would do a filibuster if I had to, but don't have to actually do the physical work of it anymore. But again, a filibuster is something that is going to keep some guardrails. And really the theme of the hope that I can offer you in terms of what is going to happen going forward is, the US government is established in such a way that there is truly a lot of checks and balances on the system. And a US president is not a prime minister, as I've said already. He or she is not a king or queen. There is some limits to the power that they have. And we'll talk about how that could have an impact on healthcare going forward. The other thing I will say is that, and we'll talk about it more specifically, but healthcare really wasn't an issue in the current election. And the one caveat I have to that is that from a US perspective, abortion was a major issue in the US presidential election. But also from a US perspective, abortion is not typically considered a healthcare issue. It's either fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your viewpoint, seen as a morality issue. So while abortion was a major issue, healthcare itself was not. Let's talk briefly about where we stand currently in terms of US impact on healthcare. And as you're probably aware, one of the biggest things over the past couple of years has been the Inflation Reduction Act. The Inflation Reduction Act, I think, is turning out to be okay from the perspective of healthcare and in particular pharmaceutical companies. As you're aware, Medicare can now negotiate for certain prices of drugs, but as with the election itself, I want to offer you the framework to understand what that actually means versus the headline. So Medicare can now negotiate the price of certain drugs, but there are a number of restrictions on that capability, not least of which is the drug has to be on the market for several years. It cannot already have established competition from generics. So those of you all in this room that are obviously very astute about the pharmaceutical industry understand that those two things don't often go hand in hand. If you've been on the market for a few years, not having generic competition is sort of unusual. So that restricts it right there. There's also restrictions on the number of drugs that the US government and Medicare specifically can negotiate prices on. The price caps for the first round were 10 drugs. Discussions began in February of this year. The price caps were announced on the 15th of August. They'll take effect in 2026. By the way, that's how we build things into legislation in the US. You talk about it, you do things, then it takes a while, then you implement it, then it takes a while. Remember that Obamacare, between the passage of the legislation for Obamacare and the actual implementation of Obamacare, was over 4 years. And so that is typical. There will be 15 more drugs for 2027. Those will be announced in February of next year, and then 15 more and 20 more. So again, from a grand scheme of things, a relatively small number of drugs that are open to this price negotiation. Let's talk about the results of that price negotiation, because as they were announced on August 15th, and those are the first 10 drugs, obviously household names in this room, it's sort of interesting because what you see in the headlines is that the average discount that was negotiated was about 50 or 60%. And if you just take, Medicare can now negotiate prices, and the first discount they got was 50 or 60%. That headline sort of potentially sends a little bit of panic into a room. What you have to realize is that most US seniors over the age of 65 who are on Medicare already have negotiated prices on their drugs. And so roughly 78% of American Medicare seniors participate in what's called a Part D program, which is the privately outsourced drug administration for Medicare, and those privately outsourced insurance companies have always had the ability to negotiate price. And so if you actually look behind those numbers, the average discount that already exists for 78% of Medicare recipients is 40 to 50%. So a 50 to 60% discount, i.e. a net of about 10%, is actually nowhere near as bad as the headlines might make you think. Healthcare policy does appear stable in the medium term. As we just talked about, the IRA sets policy for pricing. Again, a divided Congress with limited majorities really is about gridlock and not a lot of significant movement. So we don't think necessarily that we're going to get any changes. PDUFA reauthorization doesn't need to be done for another 2 years. The FDA commissioner currently is in place. Technically, we'll see what goes on there, but we will follow those developments. Okay, here we go. The actual impact on the healthcare sector. As I've already said, healthcare, as you can see on the left there, was not a top issue for voters in the 2024 election. To be blunt, it is not necessarily Trump's favorite topic, as evidenced by the debates. And I think at the end of the day, with this weak control, healthcare is not, as we say in the US, the hill worth dying on for the Republican Party at the moment. I think you'll see their focus on different areas. What do we need to think about? As I said, Trump's approach to healthcare, always going to be unpredictable, but it is not one of his favorite topics. It is not the center of his focus. From an Obamacare perspective, tried to overturn Obamacare last time, as is famous, was failed by one vote. Remember, in the first half of the first Trump administration, they had control of both the House and the Senate. If it was going to occur at any point, it could have or would have occurred there. In the intervening period, states that are very strongly Republican, that were not or had not expanded Obamacare, many of them have expanded Obamacare in the meantime. This is a very popular US program. It is not going to be overturned. Where it is a danger is that they could starve it legislatively. So again, as I talked about, the House does control fiscal legislation, and Obamacare needs to continue to be funded. And that can change over time, but again, it is very popular. What do we know? Well, historically, Republicans have favored private insurance, and typically, over my 30-plus year career, typically in a US election, if the Republicans won, the healthcare industry went, yay. We'll see. But again, they also traditionally and typically have favored fewer regulations, have been more favorable towards mergers. Those are all positives from healthcare as a business perspective. And they are typically skeptical of PBMs, which try and control drug prices. Services are most likely going to be impacted, so perhaps not directly relevant to people in the room necessarily, but there's a lot of technical changes that could be made that will potentially be detrimental to the profitability of US hospital companies and other service providers. So now we've talked about the election, now we've talked about the impact on healthcare, now let's talk about the wild card or the big pink elephant in the room, which is RFK Jr. Nominated as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, first question that pops to my mind is, can he be approved by the Senate? And I think that is a real question. Uncertain as to what the answer is, but I think it's a real question. If you look at the nominees that President-elect Trump has put forward, many of them have been quite controversial. Probably the most controversial is Matt Gaetz for Department of Justice or Attorney General. It looks at this point that that is unlikely to proceed. The oxygen in the room has been taken up by that discussion and that debate, so we haven't even gotten to RFK in many ways. But I think for obvious reasons, he's an anti-vaxxer, he has some conspiracy theories about many things, but he is not going to be an easy person to actually approve. So there's a question mark as to whether he can be approved and whether or not that will be the first test of Trump's power. So let's talk about vaccines, and let's talk about, and I'm trying to keep this at a perspective that it's of interest to you, but we need to get into the weeds about some of the technicalities about these things. And one of the ways that we've done that already is by talking about the restrictions that the US president has, the restrictions that we have in Congress. So there are restrictions on what the Secretary of Health and Human Services can and cannot do. And the obvious concern in the room would be, what is the impact on the FDA? And so first of all, yes, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is basically the boss of the administrator of the FDA. And so there's some concern that pops up there. At the same time, the Secretary of Health and Human Services does not control the FDA. The Secretary of Health and Human Services does not set the rules, regulations, and procedures of the FDA. FDA specifically was brought into being by a specific act of Congress. And it is Congress that funds the FDA year after year. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services can have an impact, but he or she does not have control, and that's an important distinction to make. The FDA commissioner is currently in place. It is sort of going to be interesting to see what happens, because traditionally, US presidents keep the existing FDA commissioner. There's actually even a question as to whether or not a US president or Secretary of Health and Human Services can fire an FDA administrator, and we'll see how that works out. There is a broader topic there, which is a lot of President-elect Trump's nominees have talked about coming into government and mass firings of people and totally restructuring sectors. There's a real question in my mind as to whether or not anyone has the power to fire a federal employee. That is partially a joke, and that is partially an unfortunate fact of life. And I think regardless of where you stand politically, there is a legitimate criticism of the US federal government, and is likely a criticism of most Western democracies, is that they are not necessarily the most efficient organizations. And one of the reasons is because traditionally you can't fire a bureaucrat, so to speak. And so it's going to be a real question as to whether Secretary nominee Kennedy will be able to step in and start getting rid of people across the board. But there is, the potential there. The actual impact on the healthcare sector is likely to be one that would be longer term in nature. And what I mean by that is, using the administrative powers that the secretary and the president would have, we can once again look to a potential that they could starve certain organizations from a funding perspective, in particular the NIH, and in particular the CDC. Now, again, depending on your viewpoint, the CDC is not exactly the most loved organization in the world right now, post-pandemic. That arguably needs to be restructured in some ways. I think the NIH is extremely admirable in the work they do, and they do it very well. The point I would leave you with on that, from that perspective, is that a president's term is only 4 years, and the term of Congress, in particular the House of Representatives, we re-elect the lower house every 2 years. Every single representative gets re-elected in 2 years. So that balance of power that we've been talking about has a real opportunity to shift once again during the what we call midterm elections coming up in 2026. So my point there is that if the Trump administration does begin to starve or restructure things like the NIH, which is obviously vital to global healthcare from a fundamental research perspective, that's unlikely to have an immediate impact. That would be a longer-term impact where 5, 10 years from now, fundamental research being done at a place like the NIH would no longer potentially exist. So there is the opportunity there that could change, and so I'm probably less concerned about it. It'll drive some headlines. It'll drive a lot of uncertainty, but I think that there's not likely to be a very short-term impact to the sector. And finally, again, as a combination of sort of a sarcastic joke and the reality, boy, the FDA and the NIH and the CDC are convoluted. They have a lot of regulations behind them. They've got very complex, well-established procedures and a huge bureaucracy. My sort of concluding hope for you from the perspective of a US strategist is that the US government is like an oil tanker. It is not like a speedboat. No matter what you want to do, you cannot just simply do a 90-degree turn in an oil tanker. Neither can you do that with the US government. And so from that perspective, combined with the checks and balances that we have in place structurally, the chaos that we worry about is unlikely to have a significant long-term impact on the sector. Having said that, it doesn't do wonders for capital markets, which is the biggest challenge to the sector right now. That, unfortunately, is unlikely to resolve itself anytime soon. So with that, let me conclude and hope that I've given you some hope and hope that I've given you a better, deeper understanding of some of the technical aspects that I look towards for the US presidential election, the results, and its impact on healthcare. Thank you very much.